If you've ever cut ties with a toxic parent or family member, you already know what happens next, because suddenly everyone wants the story. And because most of us who've lived through emotional abuse are kind of starving for validation, we tend to hand that story over. But we shouldn't be handing these stories over to just anyone who asks. And the real problem with that isn't what you think. There's a hidden cost every time you do. And once you see it, you'll understand why this boundary is so important. My name is Christina, and I help people find peace after emotional abuse. And if you're still finding yourself needing other people to validate your story, I've linked a quick quiz below to help you see what might be holding you back from finding your very own peace. So let's talk about why this boundary gets crossed so often. It's not just abusers who demand explanations. It's also people you might never expect. So friends, coworkers, even family members who actually do care about you might ask these questions. And sometimes people ask because they want to understand. But often, the reason goes deeper. And it has less to do with you and more to do with them. So here's what I mean. Research shows that our brains don't like uncertainty. We're wired to look for quick answers and to put things into boxes. So when someone hears your story, their mind jumps to judgment. Is this right or wrong? Is it reasonable or unreasonable? And that judgment is absolutely shaped by their own bias. And that looks different for each person. Some people will still have allegiance to the person you cut off. Others carry a bias because they simply can't imagine themselves making the choice that you did. But then again, they didn't live the life that you did either. Or maybe some people don't understand because their experience with that same person was completely different than yours. So your version of the story doesn't line up with one they know. So think about any famous story that people argue over. So there's Romeo and Juliet, The Great Gatsby, and even more modern shows like The Sopranos or Lost. Everyone reads the same words or watches the same ending, right? But they walk away with wildly different interpretations depending on their own values, imagination, experiences, and loyalties. The same thing happens with your personal story. The way people respond has less to do with what actually happened and more to do with the lens they bring to it. And if you've ever gotten no contact with a parent, you've seen this play out right in front of you. People want the receipts. They want the backstory so they can decide if your choice was valid. And some side with you and some won't. But either way, your truth stops being about you and starts being about their comfort with your story. So now let's talk about the other side of this. Why so many of us hand our story over so easily? Because if you've been through emotional abuse, you probably know this urge pretty well. Sometimes you find yourself telling the whole thing before anyone even asks. And part of this comes from toxic conditioning. In dysfunctional families, you're taught not to question, not to challenge, and not to air the dirty laundry. So you go along to keep the peace and protect the image. So when you finally break free, the dam bursts, and suddenly you're oversharing, and you're handing out your rough draft to anyone who will read it. You're desperate for somebody to finally say, I believe you. I get it. And there's also a nervous system piece to this equation. So for a lot of us, explaining feels like safety. And this is a fawn response. You think, if I can just explain enough, maybe people won't get angry, or maybe they'll actually understand. So we add more context, hoping that this will be the time that someone will give us the response we so desperately need to hear. And here's the science behind that. Studies show that social rejection lights up the same pain centers in the brain as physical injury. So when someone validates our story, it feels kind of like medicine, like relief. And when they dismiss it, it feels like a massive pile of salt was just poured into your wound. And that's why the pull to keep telling, retelling, and oversharing is so strong. We're wired to seek that soothing, even when it comes at a cost. So there is also another reason we tend to hand over our story. And this one can be especially hard to resist. It's when the other person flips the script and plays the victim. I know so many of you know what I'm talking about. So at this point, you're not just telling your story for connection or understanding, you're telling it to clear your name, to set the record straight. Because the idea of that person painting you as the villain just feels unfair and unbearable. And this is where both your pain and your ego can get triggered. So on one hand, you desperately want validation. You want people to see that you weren't the one who caused the damage. But on the other hand, it's the audacity that gets you. You can't believe they're out there rewriting history, making themselves look innocent while you carry the blame. And so the temptation is to defend yourself, to lay out every fact and detail like evidence in a trial, to prove that this is really what happened. But here's the trap. The more you fight to set the record straight, the more power you actually hand back to them. Your story stops being yours again. It becomes a reaction to theirs. And the truth is, the people who are determined to believe their version usually aren't interested in reading yours with an open mind anyway. So the problem is, every time you give your story away like that, you often end up feeling worse. And you know what that feels like, right? You walk away from the conversation feeling kind of smaller than when you started. And so you're second guessing yourself, you're replaying what you said, maybe even wondering if you should have kept quiet altogether. And that's because once your story leaves your hands, you don't control it anymore. It's up to the other person how they interpret it and whether they hold it or whether they toss it aside. And if they dismiss it, it feels like a crushing blow, like they've just erased your reality. And if they validate it, that can definitely feel good for a moment. But that moment is very fragile because now your sense of safety depends on whether they continue to approve. And either way, the power is out of your hands. What was once your truth has become someone else's material to analyze, validate, or discredit. And this is why the oversharing cycle feels so exhausting, because it doesn't ground you as you might have hoped. Instead, it destabilizes you. You're left waiting for other people to weigh in on a story that only you can really validate. And I want to be clear that not everyone who asks about your story is trying to critique it. Some people really do care, and the difference is in how they approach it. A safe person doesn't demand the story. So they don't need every chapter in chronological order to decide if you are worth supporting. They trust you as the author of the story, and they let you share at your own pace. And one big red flag is when someone gets really pushy about asking. If they press you for details you've said you don't want to share, or if they make you feel guilty for setting limits. If they do those things, they're not concerned about your well-being at all. Maybe they just want the gossip, or they just can't wait to rush to judgment. But they aren't pushing because they care. Someone who truly loves you and cares about you will let you keep parts of the story to yourself until you're ready to share them, or maybe forever. They don't need evidence before they can stand beside you. And the way you can tell the difference between these types of people is simple. With safe people, you leave the conversation feeling lighter, supported, and more sure of yourself. With unsafe ones, you walk away feeling drained and doubting yourself. So if you ever feel that way after you tell your story, make a mental note that that person probably wasn't safe to share with. So how do you know when it's time to close the book and keep the story with you? That is, to just stop sharing it. And one sign is that you start to feel defensive, like you're on trial. Another is that you catch yourself adding more and more detail, almost like footnotes, hoping the other person will finally get it. And the biggest sign is you leave the conversation replaying what you said and wishing you hadn't shared so much. And that's when a boundary needs to step in. And this boundary doesn't have to be complicated. It's as simple as just saying less. So you might say something like, "That was my decision." Or, "I don't go into details about it anymore." Or you may say something like, "I'm not going to share that part of my story." And the key here is to close the book without an apology. because no one is entitled to your story. So you do not have to apologize for not sharing it. It is yours to share with whoever you decide to share it with, whenever you decide to share it. And so then there's obviously an internal piece to this too, because we are seeking that validation. And if you stop sharing your story, then you're not going to get it from other people. And that's a good thing, because that, again, is very variable. It's very fragile when you are allowing other people to validate you and you're kind of hanging your sense of self on their opinions. So the internal piece is reminding yourself that the truth doesn't get stronger when other people believe it. It gets stronger when you trust yourself enough not to keep putting it up for debate. When you stop giving people the power to edit your story, you step back into your role as the author. And the most important review isn't from anyone in the audience. It's from you trusting that your story matters as is. And if you're sitting here struggling to stand in your own integrity, as you should, and you're worried about what that narcissist might be saying behind your back, I want you to watch this video right here, because not only do I cover what they might be saying about you, we also cover why it doesn't matter. So go ahead and give that a watch. And if you haven't liked this video already, go ahead and do that now. And I will see you next time.